Okay, so I just want to take a second to go through from a mechanical perspective why we saw such a sell-off today. I want to preface this though by saying this isn't the sole reason why this happened. There's not usually one sole reason, it's usually a whole accumulation of things. But there's some really interesting dynamics that just made this whole situation basically just go from bad to worse and effectively just come in with a wrecking ball into the market. So firstly, let's look at gamma. We were negative gamma across basically the entire range today. You can see at the start of the day, we hovered very much along this gamma flip zone. Now that is where gamma goes from positive to negative. Down here, it's positive up here, either side of this black line. Now, as we know, when we are in negative gamma environments, such as through here, generally speaking, what happens is dealers will hedge or market makers will hedge with the direction of the move, and it amplifies moves and it gives us more violent and quicker directional moves. So you can see as soon as we really started to sell into this negative gamma range, we just sold all the way through it until we hit kind of more positive gamma, albeit in relatively small amounts, towards the end of the day, and we did start to see a little bit of stability down here. But this alone isn't what we saw. We also had suppressive charm throughout most of profile. So again, up here, charm is relatively supportive, but as we started to sell off, look what happens. Look especially at these values up here. Look what happens to charm. We go from negative charm values, and negative charm values are supportive. I know it's backwards to what you might think. Negative charm values are supportive, positive charm values are suppressive. As soon as we start to sell into this area, we get into the suppressive charm area. Now, one thing to note here is look at the time down here. This is about midday, and look at the values here. So we're looking at sort of 28, between 25 and 29 in this area. That is quite significant. As a general rule of thumb, I generally tell people that anything around 20 or higher before midday is fairly significant. Okay, so we now have two things at play. We have negative gamma, which is amplifying the directionality of the move, and suppressive charm, which is also kicking in at this point to further pull us downwards. We also have something else. So Varna, we had positive Varna across this entire range, positive Varna with slight negative speed. Now this means that as the market sold off, market makers accumulate longer Vega exposure. So this forces them to sell volatility into a falling market, which essentially pours gasoline onto a fire. So there's somewhat of a reason for this that we talked about in the Discord the other day, and that is there's a really large Morgan Stanley trade, I think it's Morgan Stanley at the moment. They have a 1.5 times 1 risk reversal, meaning that they are long 15,000 of the 6,300 puts and short 10,000 of the 7,000 calls, delta hedged at 6,765. Where was the high of our day? 6,765, more or less. I think it might have been like 6,766 or something, but it's more or less at that level. Now, this is significant, right? This is a really, really, really big trade, and the dealers are on the opposite side of it. So dealers are short the 6,300 puts and long the 7,000 calls. This creates an enormous Varna imbalance of around $2 million per 1% spot move, which translates to around 100 million of delta per one volatility point move. So during this sell-off today, when you accumulate the gamma with the charm and then this Varna effect, this trade basically just, as we failed to break above where those calls are delta hedged at 6,765 and we accelerated lower, those dealer short 6,300 puts start gaining Vega. Now, remember, dealers are positive on across the range already. But this massive institutional trade just adds even more concentrated pockets of Varna exposure is probably the best way to describe it. So every tick lower means that dealers are accumulating more and more and more and more Vega that they then need to shed by selling volatility into a declining market. So with $100 million of delta needing to be hedged for every one vol point move and volatility naturally expanding on the sell-off, dealers face enormous selling pressure. So that 10,000 contract size, I believe, represents roughly around 6.7 billion notional at current levels. That's more than meaningful. But now, the last thing, what did we just say? $100 million of delta needs to be hedged for every one vol point move, and volatility is expanding naturally because of the sell-off. What worsens that further is dealers' vol positioning. So we know that dealers are net short this entire range. Okay, and actually vol at 28.5 was where we stopped today, and we couldn't break above it. Now, so put all this together, you have market makers being net short this entire range on the vol profile, which obviously creates negative gamma throughout this entire range. Go back then to SPX, where we also have negative gamma at this entire range, as well as suppressive charm, and as well as all of that Varna and Vega influence that we talked about. You have a literal recipe for disaster. Like, the stars could not have been worse aligned, if that makes sense. Literally every single thing about this was like, we're not going in the direction that you want today. As soon as that sell-off started, it was just this snowball effect. Now, there's going to be other things happening in here too. I'm sure along the way down here, we definitely hit some sell signals from vol sellers, from vol control funds, from CTAs, etc. So there will be even more going on in the background. That's why I said I want to preface this by saying this is not like the absolute be all and end all of what happened here, but it's obviously significant, and the stars aligned for a horrible day and also a very violent day, and that's why I had such, or at least partly why I had such a violent sell-off move into the downside. So hopefully this will make sense. But obviously, if anybody has any questions,